Hi everyone, happy Friday and welcome to this week's Science Podcast. I'll admit my first update is on a study that I thought was interesting because it opens up a new pathway to study causes of autism, but actually I really wanted to wait to report on it until there was more of a story to tell you. Unfortunately, the press and some prominent websites are carrying somewhat of a misinterpretation of this study, which is likely to get out of control. I know, so what else is new? This sort of thing happens all the time. But if this podcast can clarify things, then hopefully it's helpful. The study has to do with exposure to a chemical used to make plastics called bisphenol A or BPA. You probably have all heard about it. It binds to the estrogen receptor and it's been tied to hormonal changes in young boys and girls. It's not a great chemical, which is why most manufacturers are banning it from their production. However, it still remains out there in different forms. In fact, 90% of people have it or other of these chemical types called phthalates in their blood or urine. It's kind of scary. We should all be worried about it and we should all be wary of exposure. I'll put a website down in the caption which lists out ways to avoid BPA. This does not matter if you have a child with autism. Unfortunately, we all are at risk of exposure to high levels of these plasticizers, so spread the word. A few days ago, there was a study that looked at urinary levels of BPA in kids with autism as compared to those without autism. The goal was to look at the metabolism or the ability of children with autism to metabolize this chemical. It was done after a diagnosis, so it wasn't supposed to be tied to risk. Unfortunately, that's not the way that other autism organizations and the media are portraying it. One Twitter post said, quote, "Study suggests #autism risk may increase with lower ability to rid body of BPA. A Facebook post said, quote, "Researchers find that reduced ability to excrete bisphenol A is more common among children with autism. Another example of gene-environment interaction affecting autism risk," unquote. This is just not true. This study had nothing to do with risk of autism. Maybe it does increase the risk of autism, but that's not what this study aimed to show. The media and other autism organizations have presented it in a way that's misleading. I'm not going to talk about the details of the study because, frankly, it was a good study. This is an attack on the study. They found an interesting result in terms of metabolomics. I'll explain that in a minute, but I think it will lead to some interesting discoveries in the area. But the reality is that this was a metabolomics study, not an autism risk study. They looked at urinary levels of BPA and another plasticizer called DEHP in children with autism and those without autism. They also looked at the metabolites of these two chemicals. They found in some kids with autism, there was a decrease in a process called glucuronidation, which metabolizes BPA. They were able to specify that it was glucuronidation, not other metabolic pathways. So one important finding is now there has been a particular metabolic pathway isolated. That's a pretty big finding, but nobody caught on. Even more interesting that there was a group of kids with autism with really, really high levels of BPA that pushed the difference. If you took them out, there were no differences in BPA at all. So the data was being driven by a group of about 9 kids with autism with crazy high levels of BPA. Why they had really high levels of BPA, we do not know, but there were only 9 of them. More studies really need to be done on these 9 kids. For example, let's look at the genes which control the enzymes for this metabolic process. There is your gene-environment interaction. My point here is not to say that BPA is safe. Far from it. We're exposed to way more than we should be. The goal here is to help you understand this study and what it showed and what it did not show. While we know more behind the genetics of autism than we do environmental factors, we need to be studying them together. Also, kind of an interesting fact, the metabolites of BPA can be just as dangerous or more dangerous than the primary compound. So if kids with autism have less of the metabolite, what does this mean? There are studies that can answer the question of risk, but this is not the one. The second finding got almost no press coverage, but I wish it would have. It addresses the issue of how females with autism present symptoms. It collected parent report data from parents of males and parents of females with children with autism on their observations and behavior in the time before their child receives an autism diagnosis. Most of the kids in the study actually had an Asperger's diagnosis, which is now autism, and the study was retrospective, which means it may be susceptible to recall bias. But the results may give a window to study females with autism in the future. Results reveal that there were sex differences across different social concerns and social strategies, as well as different types of social behaviors. These findings provide insight on why it may be more difficult to detect the early signs of autism in girls. So let me give you an example. One example is mimicking. Mimicking behavior included imitating adult interactions, peer interactions, or social interactions that were seen in the television or movies. Girls were actually more likely to engage in imitation. Also, a handful of girls were reported to use isolation to manage social situations. However, isolation was a commonly reported strategy for boys. Researchers also found that the most striking behaviors were most noticeable when they became difficult to manage. This means that girls may be able to fly under the radar if they're not obviously showing behavioral difficulties. Finally, while research suggests that girls present with fewer restricted and repetitive behaviors to boys, the analysis that this study did suggests that it's probably the nature of the interest that differs. For example, the majority of parents of boys reported that their primary concern was things like spinning wheels or lining up cars. These behaviors were commonly associated with autism. In contrast, this was only a concern for a couple of girls. Girls were more likely to show obsessional interest with toys or seemingly random objects like shells or feathers. Also, in another study this week, published from John Constantino's group at Washington University, they noticed that boys and girls scored in different patterns on a key feature of autism, social responsiveness. So this was after a diagnosis, looking at something called the social responsiveness scale. Girls had what was called a bimodal distribution. That is, girls with autism scored very impaired on social responsiveness or very unimpaired on social responsiveness. This was in contrast to boys who scored, somewhat impaired or very impaired. So this is more evidence that the features of males and females with autism are separate but equal, meaning autism is autism, but the way autism is defined in males and females may need to be adjusted. Clinicians should consider a wider array of what is labeled as repetitive behaviors or social interactions when looking at girls. Thank you for joining us this week. I will be continuing to post news on our Facebook page and our website, so I look forward to talking to you soon.